They called him just Frank. Not Mr. Sullivan. Not Sir. Just Frank. The kind of name people use when they've already decided you don't matter. Frank Sullivan, 74, worked the East Gate at Ridgecrest Military Academy. Every morning at 5:45 sharp, he arrived in a weathered security jacket with a patched name tag, a steaming thermos clutched in one gnarled hand, and a dignified nod for every cadet who passed. Most didn't return it. He walked to work. Always. To the young officers and cadets, he was invisible. An old man with arthritic knees, a clipboard, and what they assumed were outdated ideas. Some whispered jokes behind his back. Others didn't even bother to whisper. Major Reynolds, one of the Academy's rising stars, once quipped loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Bet he thinks carrier pigeons still win wars." Frank said nothing. What they didn't know, what no one bothered to ask, was that he once led elite teams across hostile territory under moonless skies. That he kept medals in a wooden box beneath his bed. That his silence wasn't weakness. It was experience choosing not to waste itself on those not ready to understand. At lunch he sat alone. Same meal every day. Black coffee, a sandwich, one green apple, his leather-bound notebook always nearby, filled with observations no one knew he was making. He didn't talk much, but he saw everything. Cadet Maya Chen was one of the few who noticed. She had saluted him on her first day. He had returned it without hesitation. "My grandfather said never judge a warrior by their current station," she told him one quiet afternoon. "Wise grandfather," Frank replied, the ghost of a smile touching his eyes. She watched as he moved, measured, precise, never rushing though never late. She noticed how he scanned the tree line when others stared at their phones. How he tested the gate latch 3 times before logging off duty. The others dismissed him, but she saw something else. Not a man stuck in the past, but a man waiting. And waiting, she would soon learn, was not inaction. It was preparation. By the second week of September, the jokes had evolved from subtle to blatant. Does Frank even know what satellite surveillance looks like? I swear I heard him ask if GPS runs on batteries. Careful. Don't breathe too hard near the old guy. He might turn to dust. Cadets laughed as they passed. Officers chuckled in break rooms. No one ever said it to Frank's face, but they didn't need to. Their tone said enough. To them, Frank Sullivan was harmless, outdated, decorative. He worked the East Gate. He nodded. He drank coffee. That was it. But in truth, it wasn't their words that cut deepest. It was the casual dismissal, the way they all assumed he had his time and missed his chance. He was tolerated. Background. A prop in a uniform. Major Reynolds, always the loudest voice in the room, seemed to make it personal sport. Young, decorated, and brash, Reynolds was everything Frank wasn't. He marched fast, spoke sharply, and quoted military doctrine like sacred text. One afternoon in the officers' lounge, Reynolds leaned over his lunch tray and gestured toward the window where Frank could be seen methodically checking the outer fence. "You know," he said, smirking, "I did some digging. Turns out our gate guy was never even enlisted. Civilian contractor, according to records." A few cadets laughed, relieved they weren't the target. "You verified that?" Another officer asked. "Absolutely," Reynolds said confidently. "That's why he keeps that notebook, so he doesn't forget which gate he's supposed to guard." More laughter. From the corner, Cadet Maya Chen said nothing, but her eyes narrowed slightly, and she watched. The following day, Frank was repairing the security keypad outside the Western Barracks. The system had been malfunctioning for weeks, but no one else bothered with it. Frank, quietly and without request, had brought his tools and gone to work. As he knelt, adjusting wires with surprising dexterity, a pair of boots approached, polished to mirror perfection. "Major Reynolds, need help, old-timer?" he asked, arms crossed, mock concern dripping from every syllable. Frank looked up, then returned to adjusting a loose connection. "No," he said simply. "No, sir," Reynolds corrected, half laughing. "We do still observe rank around here." Frank stood slowly, not defensive, just deliberate. "Didn't realize gate duty warranted formal address," he said, voice steady as stone. Reynolds leaned in slightly. "Everything requires respect, especially from support staff." For a long moment, the two men just stood there, one inflated with youthful certainty, the other still as a mountain. Frank finally spoke. "Respect isn't given by stripes. It's revealed by actions." Reynolds scoffed. "Yeah, well, actions don't stop intruders." Then he walked away, shoulders stiff with indignation. That night, Maya walked past the security booth and found Frank alone, sipping his coffee and making notes by the dim light. "I heard what Reynolds said," she began softly. "He doesn't know you." Frank didn't look up. "He doesn't need to." "But he should," she insisted. Frank turned to her then. His eyes were calm but deep with something that made her stand straighter. "I'm not here to be known. I'm here to see what others miss." She nodded, unsure what to say next. Before she could turn to leave, he added, "They always laugh until they can't afford to anymore." The next day, during a breach simulation, the alarm system failed to engage on time, a delay of mere seconds, but in real combat, seconds cost lives. Major Reynolds blamed technical interference. Cadets grumbled about faulty programming. But Frank was already at the main panel that morning, examining the timestamps. He made no announcement, no accusations. Instead, he quietly adjusted the system clock manually and noted the calibration error, something the automated system had failed to correct for weeks. By noon, the security alerts were running in perfect sync. Reynolds took credit during the command briefing. Frank said nothing, but Maya saw. She always did. By week's end, something subtle began to shift. Not with Reynolds or the senior officers, but among the cadets. Some started greeting Frank by name. Some asked quiet questions about perimeter zones or weather patterns. One even stopped by the booth and awkwardly asked if Frank had ever seen action. Frank only smiled. Long enough to know better, and still the jokes persisted. Reynolds continued holding court with his back-slapping bravado and derisive humor. He talked about combat like it was a video game. He barked commands as if volume proved worth. But Maya had started listening to someone else, watching someone else. Because while others laughed at the man who took his time checking locks, she realized something important. The ones who walk slowly often see farther. It happened on a Thursday, just before dusk. As the academy prepared for evening drills, the perimeter system glitched, only for a moment. A flicker on the southeast camera. Most would have missed it. Frank didn't. He rewound the feed, eyes narrowing. A shadow moved where it shouldn't have. No sound, no alert, just a quiet disturbance near the tree line. He called it in. Possible breach, southeast quadrant. Recommend immediate inspection. Major Reynolds' voice crackled back, dismissive. No confirmation. Probably just wildlife. We're not chasing shadows, Frank. But Frank didn't debate. Instead, he signed out for a maintenance sweep and walked the perimeter with his flashlight. The air was damp, heavy still. He found what he was looking for near the drainage culvert. Footprints, not cadet boots. Civilian. Deep and recent, too fresh to ignore. The next day, he filed a report. Not through official channels, he knew better. Just a folded note on General Harrison's desk. Fence line compromised. Internal systems blind to southeast quadrant. There was no response, but that night, the breach returned. Two figures slipped through the blind spot. Quiet, precise. Gone before alarms triggered. And Frank, watching from his booth, knew in his bones. This wasn't practice anymore. The fourth breach came without warning. No blaring alarms, no red lights, just darkness. At exactly 2:17 a.m., Ridgecrest Military Academy went black. Power failed across the campus. Cameras dropped, gates froze. For 13 full minutes, the entire security system was blind. Cadets stirred in their bunks. Lights flickered but never returned. Some thought it was a drill. Others blamed a storm. Only one man understood the truth before anyone else. Frank Sullivan was already moving. He hadn't slept. He never did during storms. While others scrambled for flashlights, Frank was walking the north fence line. Rain slicked his coat. The wind cut through to his bones, but his steps were sure. At the southeast culvert, he stopped. Footprints again, but this time different. He knelt, pressed his hand to the muddy ground. The imprints were fresh, deep. Not one pair. Two. And they weren't running. They were coordinated. He reached for his radio, static. The blackout had severed communications. So he moved swiftly, silently across campus. Major Reynolds shouted orders in the dark. Secure the barracks. Lock down the mess hall. Get me a status report. But there was no status, no visibility, no control. And that's when Reynolds realized something chilling. He wasn't in charge anymore. No one was. At 2:34 am, the emergency generator finally kicked in. Lights surged back on, but it was already too late. The intruders were gone, no evidence left behind, but a broken latch and a deactivated sensor still blinking red. Reynolds stormed into the control room, barking demands, furious and humiliated. Who let this happen? The answer came not from the staff, but from a notebook Frank placed on the console, open to pages with precise times, locations, and breach patterns charted over a week. You were warned, he said simply. You chose not to listen. Reynolds' face flushed. You should have come to me directly. Frank met his gaze. I did. Then he walked out, past cadets who now stood a little straighter when he passed. And for the first time, they saluted first. The morning after the blackout, Ridgecrest felt different. Not because of the system's rebooting, but because no one could quite look at Frank Sullivan the same way anymore. They tried. Reynolds pretended nothing had happened. Cadets returned to drills, but whispers moved faster than formation calls. He knew. He had it all written down. That notebook wasn't just for show. Someone had even photographed a page. It circulated through dorms like contraband. An intricate hand-drawn map of the perimeter with breach intervals down to the second. Someone else murmured the word commander. That afternoon, General Harrison arrived. No convoy, no ceremony, just a black sedan and a folder tucked under her arm. She walked straight into the security office, where Reynolds stood reviewing the overnight logs again, desperately searching for some defense, some excuse. Harrison didn't ask permission. She spoke clearly. You dismissed multiple warnings. Reynolds stiffened. We had no verified threat. You had Frank Sullivan. He flinched. With all due respect, he's a gate guard. Harrison opened the folder. Inside was a single photograph. A younger man, sharper jaw, darker hair, but unmistakably Frank. He stood beside Harrison years ago, both in full combat gear. Then why, she said, laying the photo on the desk, is he standing next to me in Kandahar as my commanding officer? The room went still. Reynolds' face drained. What? Harrison's tone didn't shift. He did special operations in 3 regions, wrote the threat response doctrine you skimmed in basic. The only reason this place isn't compromised is because a man you dismissed still did the job you were too proud to learn. She closed the folder. You've been relieved of security oversight, effective immediately. Outside, Frank stood at the gate as usual, nodding at each cadet who passed. Only now, the nods came back with more weight, more understanding. Cadet Meyer approached with a small, precise salute. Sir, she said, voice firm. They're saying you wrote the field manuals we use. Frank gave a small shrug. Someone had to. She smiled. Then maybe it's time we actually read them. They didn't call it a ceremony. No speeches, no flag folding, just a briefing in the academy's main hall. Mandatory attendance, but every seat was filled. Cadets sat in silence. Officers stood in the back. The podium remained empty longer than expected. Then General Harrison entered. She didn't bring charts or presentations. "Frank Sullivan," she began. "Some of you knew him as just Frank. A man you overlooked, a man you dismissed." She let the silence settle before continuing. "You mocked experience. You ignored patterns. And you almost paid the price. He prevented a breach with no weapons, no rank, no title. Just judgment earned over decades. Judgment that was silenced by ego." Then she stepped back, and Frank walked in, same uniform, same quiet steps. He said nothing at first, just looked out at the room that had once seen him as invisible. "I didn't stop the breach to prove anything," he said finally. "I did it because it was my post, and you protect what's in front of you." A pause. "That's what leadership is, not shouting, not medals. It's knowing who's watching when you think no one is looking." He turned to leave, then stopped. "And if any of you want to learn that, really learn it, I'll be at the gate." Later that week, a new sign was mounted at the east entrance. "Sullivan Post, in honor of Vigilant Watch." Frank didn't ask for it, didn't even comment, but when he passed it, coffee in hand, he did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He smiled. Just a little. Frank never said goodbye. No announcement, no farewell lunch. One morning, the east gate simply opened without him. A note was left behind, folded neatly on the desk. "The watch never ends. It just changes hands." And with that, he was gone. They searched for him at first, called, emailed. No answer. But every cadet, every officer knew it wasn't a disappearance. It was a passing of the torch. Maya Chen now stood where Frank once did. Same posture, same steady gaze. And beside her, pinned inside the booth, was Frank's notebook, open to the final page. 6 words. "Respect is earned in silent service." No lectures, no doctrine, just a sentence that had become scripture. Months passed. New cadets arrived. They heard the stories, how a quiet gate guard once outsmarted intruders, saved the compound, and humbled leadership with a single notebook. Most thought it was just legend until they met Maya. Until they saw how she paused before every decision, how she walked the fence before sunrise, how she trained new guards not in tactics but in patience. She never raised her voice, but somehow they listened. On a quiet spring afternoon, a black SUV stopped briefly at the gate. An older man in a worn coat stepped out just long enough to leave something at the post, a box wrapped in canvas. Inside, a folded uniform, untouched, and a note scribbled in familiar handwriting. "For whoever watches next, make it count." No return address, no signature, just a legacy they never saw coming but would never forget. Frank Sullivan was never one for speeches. He never told people to respect him, never demanded loyalty, never once said, "I used to be somebody." But he didn't have to, because every day, in every quiet choice, he lived by words he never spoke aloud. Be steady. Speak only when needed. He showed it when he stood at the gate in pouring rain, even when no one noticed. He showed it when he didn't lash back at the laughter. He showed it when he warned them, gently, quietly, of the breach they chose not to believe. And he showed it most clearly when, after the truth came out, he refused the spotlight, refused the title. He didn't need to reclaim his rank. He had already reclaimed their respect. At Ridgecrest Academy, they still call it Sullivan Post. New cadets are told the story during orientation, not through slideshows or commemorative plaques, but by walking the perimeter at dawn in silence, just as Frank did. Lieutenant Maya Chen keeps his notebook sealed behind glass, not to preserve it, but to remind everyone that leadership isn't loud. It listens, it waits, it watches, and when it speaks, it means something. So no, Frank Sullivan never said those 5 words. But the Academy still echoes with them. In every pause before judgment, in every salute offered first, in every young leader who learns that silence, earned through service, carries more weight than any command. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday life stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.